The golden age of America, a period of unprecedented dominance, might be drawing to a dramatic close. For nearly a century, the American empire has stood as the undisputed global hegemon, accounting for a staggering 20% of global income with just 4% of the world's population, and commanding almost 40% of the global military budget. Yet, the sands are shifting and at an alarming rate. By 2028, China is projected to eclipse the U.S. as the world's largest economy, a culmination of decades of strategic positioning to usher in a new global order. Since 2010, China has poured over $1 trillion into developing nations, meticulously forging alliances while the American world order teeters on the brink. Government debt has spiraled, with interest repayments consuming a sixth of the annual budget, and the carefully constructed edifice of globalization is unraveling before our very eyes. The trust America painstakingly built over generations is eroding, chipped away by erratic policies, tariffs, and a growing sense that the rules no longer apply. Power, as has been warned, tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. This isn't merely about one leader. It's about the perilous consequences when an empire, long after its foundations have begun to crack, starts to believe in its own invincibility. The question isn't just about the current political climate. It's whether America has crossed a point of no return. The infighting has already begun, but can the American world order survive? Or are we witnessing the opening act of a new global empire? The answer, as you'll discover, is far more complex than it appears, and its roots extend back decades. How America sealed its own fate. You won't believe what they missed. Just a few decades ago, the notion of the American empire crumbling would have been met with laughter. The 1990s saw the U.S. celebrating the collapse of the Soviet Union, with the dollar solidify its position as the undisputed global currency, by 1995 accounting for an astonishing 71% of global foreign exchange reserves. America was officially the bedrock of the global financial system, and its core tenets, capitalism and democracy, were rapidly spreading across the globe. Even long-standing rivals like Russia, Poland, and Vietnam seemed to embrace market systems. The American empire had never appeared stronger. But while America reveled in its post-Cold War glory across the Pacific, a seemingly insignificant nation was quietly laying the groundwork for its own economic miracle. If you're watching this, you likely know the story. By the 1990s, China had embarked on a transformative journey that would reshape its economy and, in turn, the global order. The Chinese economy would consistently grow by over 9% annually, lifting millions out of poverty. Far from being concerned, Washington elites at the time viewed this as a triumph. Another communist power embracing the virtues of market systems. When China joined the World Trade Organization in 2000, President Bill Clinton didn't just see a trade deal. He envisioned a pivotal moment for China's future. He declared, by joining the WTO, China is not simply agreeing to import more of our products. It is agreeing to import one of democracy's most cherished values, economic freedom. The fact that China remained a one-party authoritarian state was dismissed as a temporary blip in an otherwise flawless capitalist success story. Surely, as the country developed, they would inevitably adopt democracy, right? To American eyes, China was proof that capitalism had won, and they welcomed the nation into the world order with open arms. From 1995 to 2010, Chinese exports to the U.S. skyrocketed from roughly $100 billion to over $1.5 trillion. But while Washington believed it was integrating China into its system, they overlooked something far deeper. Like dripping water eroding stone, China wasn't being transformed. It was quietly, patiently, transforming its position in the world. The shocking secret of China's rise. America's biggest blind spot exposed. Economies typically undergo a profound transformation during development. Initially, they focus on agricultural goods, with the majority of the population engaged in subsistence farming. Over time, populations shift to urban areas, and employment transitions to industrial and manufacturing jobs. This exact trajectory played out in China. From 1990 to 2020, Chinese manufacturing output exploded from approximately $100 billion to almost $5 trillion, an increase of over 50 times. China had officially become the world's factory, and American consumers were all too eager to oblige. A staggering 97% of laptops and 78% of smartphones bought in the U.S. are made in China. And it wasn't just technology. 80% of all sporting goods and about 83% of toys in the U.S. also originated from China. Far from being independent, America had, perhaps unknowingly, become completely reliant on China. To be clear, for the American consumer, on a superficial level, this seemed beneficial. They gained access to a wider array of cheaper products than ever before. As inexpensive Chinese products flooded the country, American consumers spent more and more filling their homes with low-cost goods, while subtly digging themselves into a financial hole. The invisible trap: how debt is destroying America from within. At the turn of the century, U.S. consumer debt stood at a steady $1.8 trillion. But by 2020, it had almost tripled to over $5 trillion. More Americans than ever were living paycheck to paycheck, relying on debt to finance their lives. And it wasn't just U.S. consumers who became reliant on cheap debt. By 2024, the U.S. government had amassed $36 trillion worth of debt. One in every $6 spent by the U.S. government is now going toward repayment of this national debt, and it shows no signs of slowing. Projections estimate that by 2034, the debt will have increased to $54 trillion. On a population level, this means that every American citizen would owe a staggering $150,000 in debt alone. Thanks to massively overspending for decades, the country finds itself on the verge of a crisis. But this is more than just a fiscal issue. It's a textbook symptom of an empire in decline. Hundreds of empires rose and fell before today, but they all followed a strikingly similar path. Their collapse isn't a sudden event, but a gradual, decades-long decline, and it almost always begins with an explosion in debt. Take the Dutch Empire in the 17th century. It was the world's leading financial power and seemed unstoppable. But gradually, the government spent more and more, living beyond its means with little worry for the future. By the late 18th century, it had already begun to crumble. The signs were clear: a bloated government, rising inequality, and over-reliance on foreign imports. Today, the U.S. finds itself in an almost identical position. Decades of overspending and dependence on cheap imports have left the country with a fragile foundation, one that looks set to collapse. China's master plan, the silent takeover no one saw coming. But it's not just declining empires that tend to follow similar patterns. The rise of them has also followed a recognizable arc. It starts with a period of rapid economic growth, a manufacturing boom, rising exports, and an explosion in living standards. Then comes a growing international presence, expanding influence through trade, diplomacy, and strategic investment. As time goes on, the rising power begins to slowly replace the old order, reshaping global politics to place themselves right at the center. Today, China matches that description perfectly. For decades, the country has been setting itself up to define the new world order. Their strategy has been simple: invest now and dominate later. Unlike the U.S. or Europe, China is not a consumption-driven economy. In America, 70% of GDP is spent on consumption, and in the UK, this is 65%. In China, only 39%. Of course, if people aren't spending their money, then they are saving it, and these savings have generated a huge reserve of cash which the Chinese government and businesses can then funnel into long-term investments. High-speed rail, green energy farms, and semiconductor factories, all financed by the country's savings. By the end of 2023, household savings had reached a record $19.1 trillion, approximately $57,000 per person. This money isn't just being invested in China. By 2010, they had begun to look to the global stage with one goal in mind: building a new world order. At the heart of this strategy was the Belt and Road Initiative. Since 2013, the country has spent over $1.3 trillion funding ports, railways, and power plants in developing countries. The project now spans over 150 different countries, even landing in Europe and encompassing over 75% of the world's population. They've also invested heavily in supporting African development, A strategic move considering that by 2050 the continent is estimated to account for over 25% of the world's population. In just the last decade, they financed 12,000 kilometers of road building and built more than 20 ports and 80 power facilities. The U.S. has had a far less impressive development record. Despite just being established, USAID, the equivalent organization, has built only 800 kilometers of road in the last 30 years, 15 times less than China. Instead, rather than building infrastructure, U.S. international policy seems to have a different focus, fighting endless foreign wars. Since the turn of the century, the U.S. has participated in over 72 foreign conflicts. Take just one of these examples, the invasion of Iraq. It cost an estimated $2.2 trillion, but after almost a decade of fighting, there was nothing to show for it. For decades, the U.S. has been acting as the world's police, trying to spread democracy and capitalism around the world, often by force. China, however, has a profoundly different approach. It isn't interested in reshaping foreign governments or imposing its political system. Instead, they operate with one objective: growing their own influence. And surprisingly, that doesn't mean more conflict. It often means the opposite. Rather than control, China seeks cooperation, building partnerships with all kinds of nations, regardless of ideology, values, or governance. Where the U.S. tries to remake countries in its own image, China is happy to work with them as they are. And now, we're witnessing a clash of these two opposing worldviews, and it looks like China is winning. In 2023, China's approval rating in Africa edged above that of the U.S. for the first time in history, and slowly, the U.S. international presence is crumbling, struggling to keep up with the efficiency of the Chinese machine. The American dream is dead. What the rich don't want you to know. But here's the thing. The shift in power isn't just playing out overseas. For decades now, there has been a quiet economic phenomenon that has slowly been killing the U.S. economy: deindustrialization. At the start of the 1960s, manufacturing jobs made up about 30% of all employment in America. By 2020, this was down to just 8%. As global trade barriers began to fall, American companies were no longer confined to domestic production. Instead, they started looking abroad, chasing lower costs and higher profit margins. At first, the shift was slow. Textile mills across the American South quietly shut their doors as production moved to cheaper labor markets in Asia. Steel towns like Pittsburgh and Youngstown, once home to hundreds of factories, began quietly closing shop. But once the floodgates were open, there was no stopping it. What began as a trickle of closures soon became a mass exodus. America's industrial base, the very engine of its post-war prosperity, began to vanish. The sector that had once provided stable, well-paying employment to millions of Americans had been hollowed out, leaving the U.S. totally reliant on China. And the problems don't stop there. The manufacturing sector had once been the great equalizer, offering decent wages, job security, and a path toward upward mobility for ordinary Americans. Without it, many were left behind in a rapidly changing economy that rewarded capital, tech, and finance, not manual labor or traditional skills. Now, you might be thinking, does all this really matter? After all, since the 1980s, the U.S. economy has more than doubled in size, boasting the fastest growth rate in the developed world. Surely all of that economic growth more than makes up for the loss in industry? But here's the issue. Economic growth figures don't take into account who the extra cash is actually going to. It's all well and good saying that the average person on paper is richer than they were 40 years ago. But this doesn't mean that most people's lives are actually getting any better. If all the increase in income ends up going to the richest in society, most people's quality of life won't change at all, no matter what the statistics on economic growth say. And in America, that is exactly what happened. Since the 1970s, the share of income received by those on middle and lower incomes has fallen, while those in the top bracket have continued to take up more and more of the country's wealth. Economic growth has made the richest few in America extremely wealthy. Today, the top 1% of the nation own over 30% of the country's wealth, up from 22% in the 2000s. But for those on lower incomes, it has meant very little. Since 2000, the average income in the bottom bracket has basically remained the same at $28,000 per year. All the while, the number of people in the bottom bracket has increased from a quarter of the population to almost 30%. While the nation celebrated booming economic figures, the reality for many has been starkly different. As the wealthiest occupy more and more of the income gains, the middle and lower classes have seen total stagnation. The American dream, the idea that anyone could achieve success through hard work and determination, now seems like a distant reality for many. To make matters worse, over the last 40 years, there has been a complete explosion in house prices. In the 1980s, the average home price cost about $60,000. Today, those same homes would cost over $400,000, an increase of over 500% at a time when real incomes for the poorest have remained totally stagnant.